How Kamma and causality really works in Buddhism. The texts tell us that after the Buddha's awakening, he sat in meditation for 49 days, experiencing the bliss of release. However, when he reported his awakening to others, his shortest expression of what he experienced was a principle of causality. Many people find this disappointing. They would like to hear that enlightenment has lots of lights and action, and they want to hear about all of the blissful and wonderful things the Buddha experienced during those 49 days. A second reason why people are disappointed by the fact that the Buddha summarized his awakening in terms of a causal principle is because causality seems very dry. It's a question of metaphysics, and many people like to believe that the Buddha avoided metaphysics and taught only psychology instead. It's true that he avoided many metaphysical questions, such as whether the universe was finite or infinite, eternal or not. But he avoided them not because they were metaphysical, but because they were irrelevant to developing the path to the end of suffering. However, there are some metaphysical issues that are relevant to the path. Because the Buddha taught a path of action, he had to teach a metaphysics of action to show how action works. His reason for focusing on this principle of causality as the most basic lesson of awakening was to show us how the mind works, and particularly how we can use the actions of the mind to put an end to suffering. This is why he had to explain causality to show what human action is, what it can do, and why. And as I explained last night, the principle of causality he awoke to is directly related to a psychologically healthy attitude toward action, an attitude that enables us both to live skillfully in general, and in particular to master the path of action that the Buddha taught. So the metaphysics and the psychology he taught actually fit seamlessly together. Causality was a very hotly debated topic in India during his time. Some teachers taught determinism, other people taught chaos, others said that human action had no power at all. So the Buddha had to explain causality to show that human action was capable of putting an end to suffering, and that we have the freedom to choose to follow the path to the end of suffering, or not. We have to remember that, for the Buddha, the mind is basically an active phenomenon, and his basic image for your mind's relationship to the environment is that you like to feed. You start with desire that comes from hunger. We take on a sense of becoming, which is a sense of your identity in a particular world of experience. The world here is related to whatever you want to feed on, and your sense of identity has to do with two things. One is your sense of what abilities you have to find the happiness you want. This is called yourself as a producer. The other sense of self concerns your identity as the being who is going to experience that happiness. That's the self as consumer. Both of these senses of self need to feed. The producer needs nourishment to produce. The consumer can't stand not feeding. Because the mind is proactive, we approach all experience with a question: what to do? As long as hunger is driving the mind, the question becomes, what to do in order to feed our hunger? Our intentions aim at finding an answer to that question. We want to escape the feeling of pain that comes with hunger, and we want to feel the pleasure that comes when our hunger is assuaged. We pay attention to this question, and our perceptions are shaped by it. We're doing this all the time, creating Kamma this way in the present all the time, and our Kamma gives results, sometimes what we want, sometimes not. Now, the Buddha's explanation of the principle of causality to explain Kamma sounds very simple on the surface. It's composed of two pairs of principles working together. When this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the stopping of this comes the stopping of that. At first glance, these statements seem to say nothing more than that there are causes and there are effects, That's the first impression you get. But when you look more carefully at them, taking the connected statements in pairs, you see that there are two principles interacting. The first pair is this. When there is this, there is that. When this isn't, that isn't. This describes causality in the present moment. The cause is simultaneous with the result, and when the cause disappears, the result immediately disappears. The second pair describes causality over time. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. From the stopping of this comes the stopping of that. The cause may appear and disappear at one time, but the effect can come and go either right away or much later. An example of the first kind of causality would be if you put your finger on the stove. You don't have to wait until your next lifetime to get the result. Similarly, if you spit into the wind, it's going to come right back at you immediately. That's simultaneous causality. An example of the second type of causality. When you plant a seed in the field, you won't get a mature plant right away. It will take time, well after you stop the action of planting the seed. What does this have to do with us? Our experience consists of the combination of these two principles. At any one moment in time, you will have the results of some past actions appearing. You also have your present actions, along with some of the results of those present actions. From the point of view of Kamma, this means that your experience is shaped to some extent by past actions, but also by present actions. And the present actions are actually the most important ones to attend to because you have freedom of choice concerning which actions you'll do in the present. Your past actions are like raw material for the present moment, and your present actions are the act of shaping that raw material into an experience. To compare this to food, your past actions provide the raw food, and your present actions put it in a form that you can actually feed on it. As a matter of fact, you experience your present Kamma prior to your past Kamma, in the same way that you find food only after the act of looking for it. This point comes in dependent co-arising. As we will see, present Kamma consists of fabrication, and the sub-factors coming under the factor of name in name and form. Past Kamma is the experience of the six senses, which comes after the factors of fabrication and name. What this means in terms of our direct experience is that by the time we're aware of sensory input, we're already primed to experience it in a certain way. This fact can cause us a lot of trouble, but it also opens the way to free us from suffering. If suffering depends on the way we prime our minds, then if we prime them in a skillful way, we don't have to suffer even when the input from the senses, past Kamma, is bad. So in this way, you have two principles of causality combining to form a causal pattern that follows some regular laws, but nevertheless allows for freedom of choice. This combination is also precisely what would be required in order to develop skills. It's because actions and their results follow a certain regular pattern that we can learn from them. It's because we have freedom of choice in the present moment that we can use what we've learned to become more and more skillful. All of this is why the Buddha never says that someone deserves to suffer because of an action. He simply says that certain actions tend to lead to certain results, but those results will also be shaped by the state of mind when those results come. If we develop a good state of mind in the present, we don't have to suffer even when encountering the effects of our bad past Kamma. If we didn't have this ability to choose our approach to the present moment, we would simply have to suffer from our past actions. And as the Buddha noted, if this were the case, no one could reach an end of suffering or gain awakening. Now, because the two different principles are interacting, they create a complex system. In physics, these are called nonlinear systems, which have many feedback loops. An example of a feedback loop would be what happens when you put a microphone connected to a loudspeaker in front of the loudspeaker. A sound picked up by the microphone will get amplified many, many times until it's deafening. That's called a positive feedback loop, not because it's positively good, but because it tends to intensify the original event. Another example would be a heater connected to a thermostat in the same room. When the heater raises the room temperature to a certain point, the thermostat will turn it off. When the room cools to a certain point, the thermostat will turn the heater back on. This is called a negative feedback loop. Again, not because it does anything negative, but because the two members work in different directions to keep each other in check. As we're practicing, we're going to learn that our mind has many feedback loops, both positive and negative, and we're going to try to take advantage of that fact, to intensify the things that we want to intensify, and to keep in check the things that would cause suffering if they got out of control. One first step in taking advantage of feedback loops comes from realizing that complex non-linear systems actually come from many simple patterns working together. The practical lesson is that we should first learn those simple patterns and not be too concerned with the complicated ways those patterns can interact. If you're skillfully in control of the simple patterns and consistently trying to develop skill in your actions, the results, however complicated, will eventually get better and better. There may be some ups and downs given that your past actions are still influencing the system, but the overall trend will tend upward. For example, in meditation, if you focus on the breath long enough, developing mindfulness, alertness, and ardency, you may not know when the results are going to come, and you may experience many setbacks, but you can have confidence that, given the fact that you keep trying, the results will eventually come at some time. The primary simple pattern of causality at work in the mind and in the world concerns moral decisions. Skillful intentions lead to pleasant results, and unskillful intentions lead to unpleasant results. This means that you can learn from your past skillful and unskillful actions, and you don't simply approach the present moment with totally fresh eyes. You may have heard some people say that each new present moment is a unique moment, but that would mean that anything you learned from the past would be irrelevant for deciding what to do right now. The Buddha, however, says that there are causal patterns that are true across the board. If you can keep those patterns in mind, then you can know how to approach any moment skillfully. An example would be the Four Noble Truths, knowing what suffering is, what its cause is, what its cessation is, and what the path to its cessation is, and knowing also that each of those carries a duty. Suffering is to be comprehended, its cause is to be abandoned, its cessation is to be realized, and the path is to be developed. You can apply this framework to any moment in time and reap beneficial results. However, complex patterns, even though they start from simple principles, do become complex as they create feedback loops, and the feedback loops feed into one another. In particular, the complexity relative to our practice to put an end to suffering comes from the psychology of a conscious mind. Sometimes intention comes before sensory input, but it can also come after. Consciousness can come both before and after craving. But even though these facts may make training the mind complex, in the practice we can learn how to take advantage of this complexity because these feedback loops allow you to change your mind at many points in the system of causes and effects. Now there are two major drawbacks in trying to master a complex system. The first is that sometimes no clear pattern is visible in the short term. Think of weather systems, for instance. Even though weather is shaped by some very basic physical principles, we all know how inaccurate weather predictions tend to be. This is because weather is a complex system. The same happens in our own minds. This is one of the reasons why we suffer from the results of our intentions, even though we don't intend to suffer, because sometimes it's very difficult to see any direct connection between our intentions, on the one hand, and the pleasures and pains we feel on the other. If lightning struck every time you did something unskillful, nobody would do anything unskillful. The problem is that often we don't directly see the connection. In fact, as the Buddha said, it's not always the case that our actions in this lifetime will yield their results in this lifetime. Sometimes their results won't even come in the next lifetime. They'll come only many lifetimes down the line. This means, of course, that we can experience the results of actions done many lifetimes ago with no idea at all of where those results come from. This not only allows us to do unskillful things without thinking we're going to suffer, but it can also drive us crazy. Some scientists once did an experiment with pigeons. With one group of pigeons, every time a pigeon pressed a green button, it got food. Every time it pushed a red button, it got nothing. These pigeons were very well adjusted. They pushed just the green button and paid no attention to the red one. With the other group of pigeons, though, if a pigeon pushed a green button, sometimes it got food and sometimes it didn't. If it pressed the red button, sometimes it got food and sometimes it didn't. These pigeons became neurotic because they couldn't trust the buttons that fed them. This is human life. This is also why when we meditate there are a lot of ups and downs. So that's the first drawback of a complex system. It's because of this drawback that we need to learn Dhamma from people like the Buddha, who was able to gain an enlarged perspective that allowed him to see the patterns that we would otherwise miss. The second drawback is related to the first. Because complex patterns are so unstable and, in their details, unpredictable, there's no guarantee that when you change the input, the system will show the effects of your actions right away. This means that when you start practicing, there's no way of predicting how soon you'll see the results you want. Sometimes you can meditate for days, for example, and see very little change in your mind. At other times, the changes come pretty quickly. It's all too easy, in the first case, to get discouraged, or in the second case, to get complacent. It's because of this drawback that we need close contact with the Sangha, people who have encountered the same vagaries in their practice and can give you timely help, encouragement when you need it, and warnings when you get complacent. It's in this way that the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha help us overcome the aspects of complex causality that would otherwise work to our detriment. But there are three other features of complex patterns that actually work to our advantage, if we know how to make use of them. The first deals with a feature I've already mentioned, the fact that feedback loops can be negative or positive. This gives you some control over what you do and don't want to develop in the mind. If there's a skillful quality you want to develop, you can try to create a positive feedback loop to make it stronger. This is what we do when we develop a sense of pleasure while focusing on the breath. Over time, the pleasure strengthens our concentration, and the concentration strengthens the pleasure and rapture. In this way, when they reinforce each other, they can provide nourishment for other skillful qualities in the mind as well. On the other hand, if there's an unskillful quality you want to weaken, or if your skillful qualities are getting out of balance, you can create a negative feedback loop to bring things under control. For instance, if you're thinking thoughts of lust, reflection on the unattractiveness of the body helps to bring those thoughts in check. Or if you're getting a little overcome by pleasure and rapture in your concentration, you can remind yourself to bring your focus to a more subtle level of energy in the body, and that brings the rapture under control. The second feature of complex patterns that we can use to our advantage is called scale invariance. What this means is that patterns operating on the small scale also operate on the large scale. For example, scientists sometimes can create weather patterns in laboratories, and that can teach them about weather patterns in real life. The same principle applies to the mind. If you learn how to deal with what's going on in the present moment, you learn the larger patterns of Kamma as they apply over large spans of time. And when you learn about the larger patterns of Kamma over large time scales, they can teach you lessons about how to deal skillfully with your mind in the present. In fact, that's what the Buddha did on the night of his awakening. He learned about the pattern of intention and views on the large scale in his second knowledge, and then applied that pattern to his mind in the present moment in the third knowledge. A third feature of complex patterns that we can use to our advantage is that in any complex system, the principles that put the system together can also be used to take the system apart. For example, in mathematics there is something called the three-body problem. A French mathematician, Henri Poincaré, discovered that if you traced the gravitational relationship among the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon, which is a complex system, it's possible for the Moon's trajectory to reach a point called a resonance. When it reaches a resonance, it will leave its orbit and go flying off in a direction that cannot be predicted, even though up to that point it has been following the laws of gravity. The laws of gravity interact in a way that gets the Moon out of the laws of gravity and its relationship to the Earth. In the same way, even though our experience is created by fabrication and our experience of space and time is shaped by our actions, we can still use our actions to get outside of those dimensions, to gain release. Sometimes you hear the idea that it's impossible to reach an unconditioned dimension through the conditions created by actions, but that idea comes from understanding causality in an overly simplistic way. When we understand that causality in the mind is complex, that complex system allows us to use our intentions to get beyond intentions. This is how the Buddha's path works. Even though suffering is caused by actions of the mind, we can use actions of the mind to get beyond suffering. This is why the Buddha expressed his short explanation of his own awakening in terms of his double principle of causality. It's because our actions fall into a causal pattern that we can learn from our actions. At the same time, the complexity of the pattern allows us to have freedom of choice and to use that freedom of choice to attain the ultimate freedom. So for a quick review of how we can take advantage of the Buddha's principle of causality. First, because complex patterns come from simple patterns, we focus on the simple patterns. We don't have to try to comprehend the whole thing. In fact, the Buddha said that if you tried to comprehend all of Kamma, you'd go crazy. But if you understand that there are certain patterns that the mind follows, and that Kamma follows certain patterns, in other words, skillful intentions lead to pleasant results and unskillful intentions lead to unpleasant results, that's all you have to focus on, the simple patterns. Try to create as many skillful causes as you can, and learn to have some patience as the results take their time to work out. Second, about scale invariance. If you understand your mind here in the present moment, you understand the issues of becoming throughout the universe, and vice versa. This is why, when we focus on the breath right now, we're learning about principles at work in our experience of the entire cosmos. It's also why learning about Kamma on the large scale can help us in our understanding of the mind in the here and now. The third principle is that you can attain something that is unconditioned by developing the conditions of your mind. This is what makes ultimate freedom possible, and why fabricating a path to an unfabricated dimension actually makes sense. Q. You've said that in samsara everything is conditioned, which means that also my choices are conditioned. But if there is free choice, does that mean that there is an unconditioned part of me which allows for me to make the choice? Is that the case? A. Absolute freedom lies very close to freedom of choice. It doesn't cause freedom of choice, so you can't say that an unconditioned part of you allows you to make the choice. But an unconditioned dimension can be accessed by exercising freedom of choice. As we meditate, we try to exercise freedom of choice more and more consciously by becoming more and more skillful in our choices. The more skillful our choices, the more we'll create conditions in the mind where we can see even more subtle levels of what's involved in making a choice. Most people don't fully exercise their freedom of choice. They simply allow their old habits to take over. But when we decide to meditate, we're going against our old habits, which means that we're trying to exercise more and more freedom of choice. Once we discover what those choices are, where the freedom lies in those choices, we will also discover that there is a point where the mind is free not to make any choices at all. That's the point where the unconditioned is found. That's the first stage of awakening. So it's by pursuing freedom of choice, which deals in conditions, that you find ultimate unconditioned freedom. Q. Does all the raw material for our present experience come from past karma, or do other forces outside of us play a role as well? A. There's a sutta where the Buddha is asked if everything we experience comes from past karma, and he says, no. Past karma is only one member of a long list of things that give rise to feelings of pleasure and pain. Other members in the list include such things as bodily imbalances, changes of the season, and mistreatment of the body. But then, in another sutta, SS9, he says that the experience of all the six senses should be viewed as old karma. The six senses, of course, include the body, which is the means by which we experience things like bodily imbalances and the change of the seasons. So in the final analysis, your experience of these things would count as old karma. As for mistreatment of the body, that would count as new karma. The best way to make sense of these two suttas is to note that the list in the first sutta comes from the medical treatises of the Buddha's time. From the point of view of the Buddha's theory of karma, this list can be used as a way of explaining how karma, old and new, works through the laws of the physical world so that you can figure out how to treat illness and pains. If you can track down the physical cause of a pain, you treat the physical cause. You don't just chalk it up to old karma and leave it at that. Only when you can't succeed in treating the pain through physical causes do you class it as an old karma pain and simply try to work around it. So yes, the raw material of your experience all comes from past actions, but it can come in different ways, some of which can be manipulated by our knowledge of science and medicine, some of which can't. The Buddha's main emphasis is on training the mind so that when we're in situations where we can't shape things through science or medicine, we still won't have to suffer when the raw material from our past karma is mostly bad. Q. Does the law of karma guarantee that justice will always be done? A. No. Remember that it deals only in tendencies. Certain types of actions tend to lead to certain results, but that the larger field of each individual's past karma, plus his or her present karma, can influence a particular karma plant either to yield abundant fruit or hardly any fruit at all. This means that when you sow seed in your karma field, you get the same kind of plant whose seed you sow, but the size of your harvest will vary in line with many other factors, some of which may not seem fair. The suttas tell the story of a murderer, Angulimala, who killed a large number of people but then had a massive change of heart, trained under the Buddha, and became an arahant. After he became an arahant, the result of his karma from killing all those people was simply that people would throw rocks at him when he was on his alms round. You can imagine that the relatives of the people he killed would be unhappy that he didn't suffer more than that. But if you put yourself in his place, you can see that it's a good thing that justice isn't always done. As the Buddha said, if we had to pay back all the bad karma we've done in the past before reaching awakening, no one would ever reach awakening, SS Sorn. His main purpose in teaching was to help us put an end to suffering, regardless of whether that suffering is deserved or not. Q. With regard to the three-body problem, it's going to take many millions of years for the moon to reach the resonance where it leaves its orbit around the Earth. I don't have that much time. A. Fortunately, the mind is not like the moon. The moon doesn't know what it's doing. We as human beings are able to know what we are doing, and we can direct our minds into that spot of resonance where we can make our way out of samsara. The spot will be found right at the point where attention and intention meet in the present moment. Past Kamma. Last night we talked about the fact that your present experience is composed of three things: results from past actions, and here actions mean intentions, your present intentions, and the results of your present intentions. Tonight I'd like to talk about the attitude we should have toward our past actions. We can't go back and change those actions, but we find that we do have various ways of dealing with their results as they come up in the present moment. There's a teaching that you sometimes hear, that to know a person's past actions, look at that person's present condition. To know a person's future condition, look at his present actions. This, though, is much too simplistic. It assumes that we have a single Kamma account, like a single bank account, and what you see in the present moment is the running balance. Actually, what you see in the present moment is only one small piece of a person's past Kamma. For instance, you may see someone who seems to be happy, with lots of good fortune in life, but that person has many seeds of Kamma in his background, and some of those seeds can be very bad. In the same way, you may see someone who seems very unfortunate right now. In other words, some bad seeds are sprouting right now, but they may also have some very good seeds in their background that are either ready to sprout or may sprout sometime in the future. The image that the Buddha uses to help us understand our past Kamma is not a bank account. It's a field full of seeds. In some of his explanations of this image, the soil in the field represents your past Kamma. In other words, your field has some good soil and some bad soil. In some of the other ways he explains this image, the seeds represent the Kamma, but the message is the same. You can have good seeds and bad seeds in your field. In either case, he says that in the present moment you can add water to the seeds in some parts of the field, and you will encourage some of them to grow, which means that you have to be very careful about what you water. Now, in some cases, the seeds are not ready to sprout no matter how much water you add. Some are ready to sprout only if you add water, and some will sprout whether you add water or not. In any case, the water stands for your attention and your delight in things. So that's what you have to watch out for, what you're paying attention to, how you're paying attention to it, and what kind of delight you find in it. This fact has many implications. One is that you don't need to ask which deed in the past left which seed in the field. As I mentioned last night, if you tried to trace back all of your past Kamma, you'd go crazy. So, sometimes when you hear someone asking, "Oh, what Kamma caused all these people to die?" Or, "Why is this person suffering?" You know the general principle, that there was some bad Kamma in the past, but you don't know exactly what the actions were. The Buddha's recommendation is that you focus instead on accepting that there are good and bad seeds in your field and in the fields of other people, and then proceed from there. If we had only good seeds, we wouldn't be human beings. We'd be up in one of the heavens someplace. All you have to focus on is watering the right seeds and planting good new seeds in your own field, and to encourage other people to water and plant the right seeds in theirs. That's the first implication. The second implication is that there's no need for remorse over your past bad actions, because remorse can be debilitating. Simply recognize the fact that you have made mistakes, resolve not to repeat them, and then spread thoughts of goodwill to yourself and to all other beings. Remember that the simple intention to incline your mind in a skillful direction is, in and of itself, already a skillful action. Nourish that inclination. That's the second implication. The third implication is that there are many potentials in the present. For example, there are potentials for pain as well as potentials for pleasure right here in your body. You can make yourself miserable by focusing unskillfully on the potentials for pain. And you can actually get the mind in a good state by focusing skillfully on the potentials for pleasure. If your focus is skillful, using the right intentions and perceptions, you can focus even on the potentials for pain in a way that puts the mind in a good shape. The same principle applies to the potentials in the mind. Your mind has the potential both for many skillful attitudes and for many unskillful attitudes. Here it's important to note that the Buddha never says that the mind is naturally good or naturally bad. He notes instead that the mind is very changeable. It can change so quickly that even he, the master of apt analogies, couldn't find an analogy for how quick it is to change. Even the flash of an eye is too slow by comparison. He also notes that the mind has potentials in both directions, skillful and not skillful. So, to be wise, we focus on developing the skillful attitudes and learn how to undercut or weaken the unskillful ones. We do this by watering our skillful attitudes with our attention and delight. Our problem is that we often delight in unskillful attitudes. We have a potential for anger, and sometimes we really enjoy it. The Buddha said what you should try to do is develop a delight in developing what's skillful and a delight in abandoning what's unskillful. This is one of the traditions of the noble ones. Some of the implications of the Buddha's teachings on past karma apply directly to your meditation. For example, if you find that there's a lot of pain, don't just sit there with the pain. Ask yourself skillful questions about it. This would count as the water of appropriate attention. At the same time, look for alternative potentials in the body and then develop those. I'll give you an example. Several years back, we had a meditation session out under the trees in the monastery, and it was a beautiful day. A light breeze. The temperature was just right. And for me, it was a very pleasant meditation. However, a woman in the group had brought along a friend who had never meditated before. After the end of the meditation, the friend announced to the group, "I have never suffered so much in my life." She suffered because of what she was paying attention to, how she couldn't move, how much pain she was feeling, how bored she was. If you pay inappropriate attention to the things that you don't like about the present moment, you actually weaken yourself. If you focus on the potentials for strength, this gives you more strength. This is one of the ways that we can learn to develop endurance and patience. You don't focus on the difficulties. You focus instead on the areas that are energizing. Try to create a good positive feedback loop. And finally, many of the same implications of the Buddha's teachings on past karma apply to the attitudes you should take when dealing with other people. This is an example of scale invariance, in that the same lessons apply on different levels of your experience, both inside and out. When you're dealing with other people, pay attention to the fact that just as you have a large field full of many different seeds of karma, but you don't know what those seeds are, other people have their own large but unknown fields too. This means that if you see someone suffering, you don't just say, "That's their karma," and just leave it at that. You have to remember that here's your chance to help them, because you may have the seeds for that same kind of karma in your background as well. If you ever fall into their situation, would you want the people around you to be indifferent? Here's your chance to develop the kind of karma that would lead other people to want to help you. There's also the possibility that the person who is currently suffering may have some good seeds that are just about ready to sprout. All you have to do is give that person the right help and encouragement, and those good seeds will be able to sprout. So, you don't know the other person's potentials, just as you don't know your own. The right attitude is that you always focus on the possibility that there are some good potentials in all of us. In this way, thinking about past karma in the correct way actually encourages an attitude of compassion for the sufferings of others. It also encourages an attitude of heedfulness about your own possible sufferings. Even though things may be going well right now, you never know when some bad seeds may mature and sprout. So you should always prepare your mind not to be overcome by pleasure or pain so that you'll be able to endure whatever comes up and deal with it skillfully. This is why we develop concentration and discernment to get rid of our greed, aversion, and delusion, so that no matter what plants come up in our field, none of them will cause us to suffer or to act in ways that create more seeds for future sufferings. Q. I was in a situation where I was forced to do something that harmed someone else. How do I live with this fact so that it is not too heavy to bear? A. Remember that Kamma depends on many different factors. When you're forced into doing something harmful, the Kamma is much less heavy than if you had done it on your own initiative through anger or ill will. Remember, too, the Buddha's recommendation that you not get involved in thoughts of remorse. Instead, simply recognize that it was a mistake and resolve not to repeat the mistake. Then spread thoughts of goodwill to yourself, to the person you harmed, to the people who forced you to do the harm, and then to all beings. You spread goodwill to yourself to give yourself more encouragement to do good now and into the future. You spread it to others to strengthen your desire not to harm anyone at all. Meditation on Kamma. We've talked about how meditation is a type of Kamma. Kamma can also be a topic of meditation. This contemplation is aimed primarily at giving the mind a sense of values as to what is important in life, what things are not important, and to give us even more motivation to do what is skillful and to avoid what is not. One contemplation on Kamma is based on the definition of Kamma in what is called mundane right view. This definition is useful to contemplate because it shows that taking Kamma seriously is not a selfish attitude. Some people say that if you're concerned with your Kamma, you're not concerned about other people. But when you actually look at how the Buddha introduces the topic of Kamma, he focuses on what we might call the social virtues, the virtues that make human society pleasant and amenable to our well-being, in the sense that our well-being means everybody's. Here's the definition. There is what is given, what is offered, what is sacrificed. There are the fruits and results of good and bad actions. There is this world and the next world. There is mother and father. There are spontaneously reborn beings. There are contemplatives and Brahmins who, faring rightly and practicing rightly, proclaim this world and the next after having directly known and realized it for themselves. If you look at this definition as a whole, you see that it affirms the teachings on Kamma and on rebirth. For example, the spontaneously reborn beings are the beings reborn in the heavens, the hells, or the realms of the hungry ghosts. Notice that this passage is not saying that one knows about Kamma or rebirth. Instead, these teachings are for you to adopt as working hypotheses. We take these hypotheses as basis assumptions for our practice, but we won't be able to confirm them until our first taste of awakening. The passages related to the social virtues are the ones that sound the strangest. For example, there is what is given. This sounds perfectly obvious, but it had a special meaning in the time of the Buddha. For millennia, the Brahmins had been preaching about the virtue of giving, especially when things were given to Brahmins. In the texts of old Brahmanical ceremonies for making merit for the dead, for example, there's a part of the ceremony where the Brahmins will address the bereaved and say, "We are speaking in the voice of your dead relatives. Give to the Brahmins." When the bereaved gave to the Brahmins, again assuming the voice of the dead relatives, said, "Give more." You can imagine the reaction that eventually developed. Over the centuries, there sprang up schools of contemplatives who said, in reaction, that there is no virtue in giving. One of their arguments was that people do not have free will, therefore even when they give things, it doesn't mean anything because they had no choice in the matter. Another argument against the merit of giving was that when people die, that's the end. There's nothing left over, so there's no virtue in giving to something that will eventually die and be totally annihilated. So when the Buddha was saying that there is what is given, he was basically saying two things. One is that we have free will. We have the choice of giving or not giving, so there is virtue in giving. Two, he was saying that there is something more to the human being than just the body. There's something that goes beyond the body. When you give to a human being, or to any being in fact, you're giving something to someone who has worth. An important point in the Buddhist approach to giving is that the Buddha never said to give only to Buddhists. Instead, he said, give wherever you feel inspired or you think the gift would be well used. So by affirming the fact that there is what is given, the Buddha was affirming one of the basic social virtues, because giving here includes not only giving material things, but also more immaterial things. You give of your time, you give of your energy, you give of your knowledge, you can give of your forgiveness, you can give the gift of the Dhamma. It's through these gifts that human life becomes worthwhile and human society becomes helpful for everyone within it. The second phrase that sounds strange is, there is mother and father. Again, this sounds almost too obvious to say, but again, in the Buddha's time, it had a deeper meaning. Those contemplatives who said that no one has any free will also drew the conclusion that the help that your mother and father gave you when you were young has no meaning because they had no choice in the matter. Therefore, you don't need to feel any gratitude toward them. So when the Buddha was saying that there is mother and father, he was saying basically that they did have the choice. They chose to help you when they could have chosen to abort you. They didn't abort you, and they helped you gain all the capabilities you need in order to function in society. So even if they weren't perfect parents, they still deserve your gratitude. This principle applies to all the people who have helped you. You have to realize that they had the choice of whether or not to help, and in many cases it took a lot of effort to offer that help. This is why they deserve your gratitude. In Thailand, there is a saying that gratitude is a sign of a good person. The reasoning behind this is that if you appreciate the help that you have received from others and show gratitude for the effort that they put into it, you will also be more likely to provide help to others. So you can see that the Buddha's teachings on Kamma affirm the social virtues of generosity and gratitude. Without these two virtues, human society would be chaos. Therefore, the Buddha is encouraging us to develop these virtues in ourselves as well. And his teaching on Kamma, as following a pattern that allows for free will, is what actually allows for these virtues to have meaning and to make sense. Another contemplation on Kamma is contained in the passage called the 5 Recollections, which is repeated daily in chants in many Buddhist monasteries and centers like Le Refuge. The first 4 reflections say, basically, I am subject to aging, I am subject to illness, I am subject to death, I am subject to separation from all that I love. In the Thai translation, instead of saying subject to, they say that aging is normal, illness is normal, death is normal, separation is normal. It's when we accept these things as normal that we can begin acting heedfully in life. Finally, the 5th reflection is this. Now, based on what line of reasoning should one often reflect that I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions and have my actions as my arbitrator, whatever I do for good or for evil, to that will I fall heir. There are beings who conduct themselves in a bad way, in body, in speech, and in mind. But when they often reflect on that fact, that bad conduct in body, speech, and mind will either be entirely abandoned or grow weaker. This reflection on Kamma, like the other 4 reflections, teaches heedfulness, but it also teaches confidence, that through the power of our actions, we can find a way out of the sufferings of repeated birth and death. We keep in mind the fact that our only true possessions, given that we are subject to aging, illness, death, and separation are our actions and their results. Ajahn Suwat liked to comment that the Buddha often teaches that this thing is not self, that thing is not self, this thing is not mine, that thing is not mine, but then would have you say to yourself, I am the owner of my actions. In this case, the sense of I does not increase your clinging. It actually makes you more heedful of your only real treasures, your actions and their results, and confident that developing skillful actions will really make a difference. So the I here is a useful I to develop for the sake of following the path. Now, if you look at your actions over the past week or so, what kind of treasures are they? Are they something that you want to put in a suitcase and carry with you on into the future? If they're not, you know what to do this week. You have to act in ways that will create treasures that you would like to keep with you. You have to treat your actions as your most important possessions. There's a passage in the canon where King Pasenadi comes to see the Buddha in the middle of the day, and the Buddha asks him, "Where have you come from in the middle of the day, great king?" And this is an instance where the king is remarkably frank. "I've been spending my time," he said, "in the sorts of things that people intoxicated with power and obsessed with greed are obsessed with." And so the Buddha asks him, suppose that there were a reliable man coming from the east saying that there's a massive mountain moving in from the east, trampling all living beings in its path. Another trustworthy man comes from the south and says that there's a massive mountain coming in from the south, crushing all living beings in its path. Another reliable man comes from the west. Another one comes from the north and says there's another massive mountain coming in from the north. So altogether, there are 4 massive mountains moving in from the 4 directions, trampling all living beings in their wake. Given that human life is so rare and you have heard this news, what would you do? The king replies, "There's only one thing I should do: calm my mind and do what is skillful and meritorious." So the Buddha says, death is moving in on you. Given that human life is so precious, what should you do? And the king repeats, "There's only one thing I should do: calm my mind and do what is skillful and meritorious." This is the principle of heedfulness combined with confidence, realizing that human life is short, that our actions make a difference, and the only thing that we can take from our life is our actions and their results. So we become more careful about what we choose to do. The Buddha, in another case, talks about 7 treasures that he says are worth much more than gold or silver. These treasures are 7 qualities of mind: conviction, virtue, a sense of shame, a sense of compunction, learning, generosity, and discernment. Each of these qualities is something you can take with you after you die. Even here in this life, fire will not burn them, water will not wash them away, kings and thieves will not take them. I think it's interesting that the Buddha put heads of state and thieves in the same passage. When you reflect on each of these qualities, you realize that they protect you from doing unskillful things, even when it's otherwise difficult to resist doing such things. You sometimes read about people living in times of war. When one side does something really awful, the other side takes that as an excuse to do something awful in return. It's very rare to find people who hold to their values and behave nobly in difficult situations like that. But if you have a sense of conviction, a sense of shame, a sense of compunction, a sense of discernment, these treasures will prevent you from doing things that you will later regret. I've learned of people who have done something really horrible in a war, and then for the rest of their lives they say, "I would give $1 million if I could go back and undo that thing." This means that these qualities, the qualities that would have protected them from doing that thing in the first place, are more valuable than $1 million. That's the principle of heedfulness. A third contemplation builds on the second one. A disciple of the Noble Ones considers this: I am not the only one who is the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and have my actions as my arbitrator. Whatever I do for good or for evil, to that will I fall heir. To the extent that there are beings, past and future, passing away and re-arising, all beings are the owners of their actions, heir to their actions, born of their actions, related through their actions, and have their actions as their arbitrator. Whatever they do for good or for evil, to that will they fall heir. When he or she often reflects on this, the factors of the path take birth. He or she sticks with that path, develops it, cultivates it. As he or she sticks with that path, develops it, cultivates it, the fetters are abandoned, the obsessions destroyed. This takes the last contemplation and extends it from yourself to all beings. It gives rise to a different quality of mind. It goes beyond heedfulness and extends to something called samvega. Samvega means a sense of dismay, a sense even of terror at having to stay in this world with no end in sight, always being required to do good actions and otherwise in danger of falling into deep suffering. In other words, in order to find well-being, we constantly have to keep doing good actions again and again and again. No matter where we go, no matter what level of being we're reborn on, we're constantly doing actions, and it's very easy when we're suffering to say, "Oh, I don't have the strength to do good actions." When we're very happy, it's very easy to become complacent and to let our good actions slip. So when you think about the danger of continuing to stay in this world of actions, with the constant requirement to be heedful and skillful no matter where you go, it gives rise to a sense of samvega. But on this level too, the reflection on Kamma also gives rise to a sense of confidence that there must be a path of practice to get out of all this. And that's what the Noble Eightfold Path is, a path of action that leads to the end of action, SS5. As the passage says, when you reflect on these facts, it gives rise to the motivation to follow the path to awakening so that you don't have to come back to any world at all. Now it turns out that actions inspired by heedfulness and those inspired by samvega are in many cases the same: generosity, virtue, and meditation. So as we're following the path, we try to contemplate Kamma in order to make sure that we're heedful to act in ways that are skillful, and also to give us the inspiration to find the path that leads to the point where we can go beyond action entirely. In other words, we look for the actions that will lead us to the end of action, SS5. It's in this way that contemplation of Kamma is a useful adjunct to meditation and is something that we should always try to keep in mind.